Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
70% of your opportunities is the cost of not listening. If I want to know what you're really thinking about, instead of saying, what are you thinking about? I'm going to get a lot more in-depth answer out of you by saying, like, seems like you're giving us a lot of thought. Because that's an appreciation of your thought process. And you're much more likely to say, yeah, I have. And here's what I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this. I mean, that observation of your thought process is much more encouraging. You're going to tell me an awful lot more.
Hi, I'm Oscar Trimboli, and this is the Deep Listening podcast series designed to move you from an unconscious listener to a deep and productive listener. Did you know you spend 55% of your day listening, yet only 2% of us have had any listening training whatsoever? Frustration, misunderstanding, wasted time and opportunity, along with creating poor relationships, are just some of the costs of not listening. Each episode of the series is designed to provide you with practical, actionable, and impactful tips to move you through the 5 levels of listening. So I invite you to visit oscartrimboli.com/Facebook to learn about the 5 levels of listening and how others are making an impact beyond words. In this episode of Deep Listening Impact Beyond Words, we hear from Chris, a global expert in the field of negotiation. And well, he should be. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator. Chris outlines the commercial impact of not listening. He says 70% of the opportunity is missed, and that's the cost of not listening. He also asks a great question. When you're in a negotiation, who's actually the fool in the game? Explore the impact of society's, addiction when it comes to communication, and understand the influence and power of exploring the negatives, the no's. Listen for the Nobel Prize-winning research that talks about the importance of loss aversion. He also talks about, who do you think is in control of the conversation, the speaker or the listener? Chris explains why controlling any conversation is a complete myth. Listen carefully as he explains the mindset of judo to maintain, to manage, and maneuver energy in any conversation. He does a great job of explaining level 1, listening to yourself and the role of breathing and how to be connected not just with your own breathing, but also the breathing of the speaker. There's a really powerful story in here where Chris talks about a very high-profile negotiation he did in Washington, D.C. Listen out for level 5 listening with Dwight, the tobacco farmer. Listen carefully as they explore the meaning around the 82nd Airborne Division and how this helps a very tense situation where Dwight has a sniper's green light on him and ready to shoot. Let's listen to Chris.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
What do you think the cost of not listening for your clients is?
70% of your opportunities is the cost of not listening. One of the companies that we were coaching recently, they've been pursuing a deal for 18 months. And they were having trouble landing it. And they hired us to help them land the deal. And we almost immediately assessed that they were the fool in the game. In one conversation, they got the client that they were pursuing to admit that they were never going to get the deal. And they pursued that for 18 months. Now, interestingly enough, the CEO of that company recently came to a training that we gave in New York. And he was so grateful that we got him, helped him get out of that deal and move on. He said, oh, by the way, because he had some land that he was trying to sell in Europe. And he said, since you got me out of that, I actually subdivided the land and sold it in total for more than I was asking for it from the first person that I was hoping to sell to. So to try and calculate how much it costs to pursue deals that you're never going to get is just monstrous. It's huge.
What do you think it was that they weren't listening to or for?
They weren't listening to the client sending them signals that there was a bad fit. They weren't listening to how much they were trying to trap the other person with yes. I mean, yes is trying to get somebody to say yes is probably the most damaging thing to rapport and business relationships, because so many people are desperate to hear yes only. They don't want to hear anything else. It's such an addiction, and we're also uncomfortable by being made to say yes. It's one of the craziest dynamics that I think that we've seen in human communication. Like, if I say to you, do you have a few minutes to talk? You're immediately going to get defensive. Like, how long is this going to last? What's the hook? Where is this going? What am I not hearing? What are you trying to trap me into? I know as soon as you start trying to get me to say yes, you're going to try to get me to say yes to more stuff, and you're going to try to lead me down the path. I mean, we all hate that. Nobody likes the question, have you got a few minutes to talk? We all immediately become defensive. It's the biggest thing in not hearing what the other side is really saying, not being willing to hear rejection.
One of the things you talk about in your book was it's okay to get a no, and that loss aversion is a bigger motivator than a positive incentive.
Well, it's not only okay to get a no, but in many cases it's preferable. People they're so addicted to yes, they become horrified at the thought of being told no. And, let's just go back to the question I brought up a few minutes ago. Have you got a few minutes to talk? It sounds stupid, but you get a vastly different effect if you call somebody and say, it's now a bad time to talk. As uncomfortable as yes makes us, no makes us feel safe and protected. So we ask people, instead of do you agree, we say, do you disagree? Would you like to do this? Instead of saying that, we say, are you against doing this? Just the mere act of flipping out of yeses and going to nos makes a massive difference in how people communicate.
When you're listening, how important is it for what the other person's going to lose rather than what they're going to gain?
The single biggest motivator of human decision-making is avoiding a loss. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in behavioral economics, and he and Amos Tversky developed a theory of the prospect theory, which is lost things twice as much as an equivalent gain. Losing $5 hurts twice as much as gaining $5 feels good. And actually, Professor Kahneman actually gave an interview where he said that's not accurate. It's not twice as much. It's actually 5 to 7 times as much. He and his partner Amos, he lowered the number to twice as much just because they wanted fewer arguments from their academic colleagues. So it's this outsized influence on our decision making. And there's sales data out there that says that 70% of buy decisions are made to avoid a loss, not to accomplish a gain, which then pretty much gets to this 2-to-1 ratio. And I know that there's sales training out there that says that you have to display 9 times value to achieve the sale, which then means there's a 9x difference between the value of loss and gain, because what they're going to gain has to be worth 9 times what they're giving up. I mean, it's this outside distorting impact on people's decision making. And there are a lot of people out there that'll say, well, like, I make deals all the time just by pitching gain, only by pitching benefit. Of course you make deals all the time. You're making a third as many as you should be. You're killing yourself, because people are more looking for how do I alleviate my problems first before they're looking for how do I accomplish gains. And it completely changes the entire value proposition approach. The reasons you won't make deals with me are more important than the reasons that you will make deals with me. And what we're finding on a regular basis, we make deals faster because if I can eliminate the negatives, if I can eliminate the barriers that's standing in your way from doing business with me, then the positives may well take over and I won't have to do the work at all. So if you're lazy, if you want to get things done faster, if you want to make more deals, you address the reasons why people won't deal with you. You address the reasons of what's standing in their way of their thinking first before you address the value proposition, which is the opposite of what they teach us in business school.
Chris, when you listen deeply, one of those big costs is the cost of the status quo. How do you help the other person understand the cost of the status quo when they may not even be conscious of it themselves?
The way you make them understand it is you got to get out of them what they're seeing in their own mind, what the comparison is that they're making in their own mind. And most people are not comparing what's actually happening. They're more comparing what they hope to have happen. But you have to understand what's going on in somebody's brain. And you do that, you do that with the application of empathy. Once you understand what's going on in their head, then you have to use calibrated questions or observations to get them to make a different comparison. What do I mean by that? If we give a negotiation strategy, someone is saying like, wow, if I do that, I can really see how that might go bad. Well, they're imagining a worst case scenario in their head, no matter what is the reality is. And our question is, all right, you could see it going bad this way. The real issue is what's going to happen to you if you don't do anything. Well, if I don't do anything, here's probably what's going to happen. That's how you get them to change the comparison. With a what question, what do you see happening versus what is actually happening? And you have to begin to explore that with people to get them to now start taking different looks at what they're comparing in their head.
I'd like you to take us back to your work where you volunteered on a crisis hotline, and how did that inform you about questions like what and how versus why?
I really learned the value of observations, which are not questions at all. The value of observations in human interactions, which, we called it reflection back then, hostage negotiation, we called it emotional labeling. Now we just call it labeling. And an observation would be like, you sound angry, or you sound certain, or you seem upset. These are just observations of dynamics. And that's a really powerful way to get through to people really quickly. It's not a question. If I want to know what you're really thinking about, instead of saying, what are you thinking about? I'm going to get a lot more in-depth answer out of you by saying, like, seems like you've given this a lot of thought. Because that's an appreciation of your thought process. And you're much more likely to say, yeah, I have. And here's what I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this. I mean, that observation of your thought process is much more encouraging. You're going to tell me an awful lot more. In a hotline, we learn mostly what and how questions, most as a device to actually confront people with. But we didn't like the word confrontation, so we called it carefrontation. And a confronting question is going to be, what's going to happen if you don't do anything? What's going to happen if you don't change your behavior? I mean, that's a great use of a what question to actually confront someone without it making them feel attacked. Now, as we went further through what I learned on the hotline and what I learned from Jim Camp's book, Start With No, and then the stuff that I learned as a hostage negotiator, we found out what and how questions were the best questions to ask if you were going to ask questions at all, which you might not always want to. And I also learned the hard way that why questions make people feel accused. It makes people feel defensive. If I say to you, why did you do that? You're going to feel like I think you did something wrong. Versus if I say, what made you do that? Then you're going to feel less accused and you're going to be more likely to answer. And that gets us into this whole other category of the problematic nature of asking people why questions to begin with. There's certain rare instances where a why question might be most appropriate because it's all kind of driven by context.
In Chapter 7 of Never Split the Difference, you make reference to like questions or observations that are actually questions. Could you give us a couple of examples of those?
The funny thing is, it makes the biggest difference as to how you construct the sentence or the thought, both at the beginning and the end. I mean, the beginning, I think what you're referring to as like questions gets back to our labels or our observations. I can say it seems like this bothers you. Now that's constructed as an observation and a downward inflection at the end because it's a feeling of a statement or an observation. And if I say, seems like this bothers you? I mean, it's the exact same word construction. Now, the inflection at the end makes it feel like more like a question. But if I'd have said, does this bother you? The fact that I started that with verbs causes your brain to react in a completely different way, both in word choice and inflection. It's not just a question, but it's a closed-ended question. And there's a completely different way that it hits the brain if I say, does this bother you? Versus, it seems like this bothers you. It's going to cause a completely different response on your part. And we are very definitely steering away from verb-led sentences that are questions, because I'm going to get a much more unguarded response from you if I get away from that construction entirely.
What Oscar does is he eloquently outlines strategies to manage that struggle between feeling like we should be leading when we'd actually probably achieve more from listening. It's relevant, it's practical, insightful, and I think most of all, it makes you reconsider what listening actually is.
You talk about listening judo, and you make some really powerful points there. Some of those you've already touched on, how and what questions versus why questions. But the most powerful point you made for me was the person in control of the conversation is actually the listener. Do you have some examples of that?
Yeah, if the listener chooses to be in control, and we're trying different ways to make the idea come alive in people's brains. And it's a lot more than what used to be described as active listening. People were so active listening. Does that mean I nod my head a lot and smile a lot? What is it to be active, or what is it to be proactive, or to know what I'm looking for, or the term listener's judo? What am I listening for that's going to change your energy? Maybe I want to use your energy against you. Maybe I want to use it with you. Maybe I want to use your energy to wear you out. I mean, what are my strategic choices that give me the upper hand in the negotiation versus having an obsession or an addiction to needing to feel like I'm in control? But I'm definitely trying to use your energy for both of our benefit. Now, if you're attacking me, I'm going to use your energy to wear you down. And that's kind of what judo is about, using the other person, the opponent's energy against them. If I'm good at judo and you come running at me and try and tackle me, I'm just going to give myself a great stance and great leverage so that your energy ultimately defeats you. Now, in a negotiation, am I trying to defeat you? Not only if you're attacking me. What I'd rather do is have a great relationship with you and collaborate with you for a long period of time. And I'm going to try and educate you to that effect that attacking me isn't going to do you any good. So that's this whole idea of judo, or the analogy is some people like Tai Chi as an analogy. I mean, in a hostage negotiation, we learn to say, to get proof of life, instead of saying, can you prove to me the victim is alive? We'd want to say, how do I know the victim's alive? How do I know the kidnapped victim's alive? And that changes the entire dynamic. I learned that specifically in a negotiation that I listened to between two drug dealers in Pittsburgh back in the early 2000s. The drug dealer victims said to the drug dealer kidnapper, how do I even know my girlfriend's alive? And we then knew that, all right, so we got to use a how question to do a better job in a business deal. And we switched that into business negotiations. Somebody wants more than I can give. Instead of me saying I can't give that, or me saying no, I'm going to say, how am I supposed to do that? And in instance after instance after instance, the counterpart on the other side has dropped the price or softened the terms or indicated some sort of greater collaboration.
In March 2003, you talked about some work that you did with a tobacco farmer, where you and a negotiation team were listening much more deeply to what Dwight Watson was saying.
We got a guy that has taken Washington, D.C. hostage. So this poor guy, Dwight Watson, his family lost their tobacco farm as a result of the tobacco settlement. Between the restrictions and the quotas and everything else that happened, his family they were tobacco farmers, and just a change in the environment caused them to lose a farm. He drives his tractor into Washington, D.C. and says, I got 4 bombs with me, and I scattered 4 bombs around the metro area, and I'm going to blow it all up if you guys don't talk to me. So we start talking to Dwight Watson, he's just a poor guy at the end of his rope. And we realize that we're going to get him out, but he keeps talking about the 82nd Airborne being behind enemy lines for 72 hours, and then they can retreat with honor. If they don't get reinforcements, if they drop behind enemy lines, they come out after 72 hours, which is his way of telling us he's going to come out after 72 hours. That's not a bad thing. He's agreed to come out, but the bad thing about it is there's still a green light on Dwight. In hostage negotiation terms, a green light is the snipers can shoot him and kill him if he does the wrong thing. And we don't want Dwight to get killed because we still don't know for sure that he doesn't have 4 bombs. And we think there's a possibility his bombs are located at this one location. The green light is if he goes back over to this location with his tractor, you got to shoot him because we don't know we have bombs. He doesn't have bombs. So we're trying to get Dwight out of there before he makes a mistake, gets himself killed. He's talking about 82nd Airborne, but in through his conversation, there are different Christian references. We're getting a sense that his religion, if you will, is really important to him. And we're brainstorming about how we're going to get him out early. And one of our negotiators tell him tomorrow's the dawn of the 3rd day. And technically speaking, from the Christian religion, Jesus rose from the dead 48 hours after he was crucified. He was crucified on a Friday. He comes back to life on Sunday morning. That's not 3 days. Monday's 3 days. It's about 48 hours, but it's the dawn of the 3rd day. So we get the sense that this is a bigger issue with Dwight. We get him back on the phone. We ask him if he's going to come out the next day, and he says no. And our negotiator says, yeah, but, Dwight, tomorrow's the dawn of the 3rd day. And he goes dead silent, and then he says, all right, I'll come out in the morning. So it was, listening between the lines, what matters on a larger level. And everybody has a religion. Everybody has things in a given moment that are more important to them than the deal themselves. Things that they die for, things that they'd sacrifice the rest of their life for and live for. And boy, if you can hear those things in any negotiation, you can really change somebody's mind.
What struck home with me is that the ability to listen, to really listen, just needs you. There is real leadership strength in paying attention and responding appropriately. And if nothing else, it's just more efficient.
One of my favourite quotes from your book is that listening is the cheapest and most effective concession you can make.
If it's even a concession, that's a crazy thing. It's this incredible gesture. It's generous. It's costless to actually listen to the other side. I don't know if it's fair even to say that it's a concession, because what are you actually conceding when you actually listen to the other side? But the benefits are huge. The upside, I don't know how many deals that I've made by hearing the other side out and then having them give in after having just been heard out. But I know those percentages are much, much higher than when I didn't listen at all. And I can tell you, people have lost lots of deals by not listening that they would have made otherwise by listening. So it's one of those strategies that in reality, it has no downside.
When was the first time you noticed that listening was this big step forward and a concession that would help the other party?
My son, Brandon, is the director of operations in my company and an enormously talented negotiator. We talk about the birth of the that's right moment. And when you've totally heard the other side out, the other side will say that's right. And I remember originally just thinking that was just basic 101 listening, when in fact it's a lot of basic 101 listening is really an advanced skill. It's a black belt skill if you can. If you can get somebody to say that's right, you are an enormously talented negotiator. Not you're right, but that's right. And I had done this in coaching and negotiation in the Philippines, where the kidnappers were demanding $10 million in war damages, not ransom payments, but war damages for 500 years of oppression, which is a pretty brilliant move, because if you can stretch out economic harm out over 500 years, it makes $10 million seem like you're not asking for that much. We got on the phone with the bad guys. I coached my negotiator to get the guy to say that's right. Summarize everything he said from his point of view. And only from his point of view, not ours. And not whether or not his point of view is accurate or the truth, but strictly from their point of view. And at the end of the summary, which seemed like it went on forever, but couldn't have taken that long, certainly took less time than we'd invested in the negotiations up to that point. You know, the sociopath on the other end of the line said that's right. And the ransom demand went away. The $10 million went away. And again, I just took that for granted at the time. And we have looked back on that, Brandon and I have looked back on that and realized that was the birth of the that's right moment. And we're cutting deals right and left or getting the other side to concede massive amounts of the points of what they want, having just gotten them to say that's right. It's insane. It makes no sense. And it's just as effective as can be.
What happened to resolve that situation?
The terrorists dropped their demand for money. And then our negotiator and the terrorist negotiator on the other side, they then suddenly had this great working relationship, but the terrorists kind of got lost and lost their focus. And we continued to negotiate back and forth. They try to get a variety of intermediaries involved in order to resolve it peacefully. And at that point in time, we just went into basically a stalling approach with them. And a couple of months later, our hostage walked away. Terrorists lost their focus. They lost their discipline. They lost their organization. Hostages walked away. The military found out that he was out wandering around the jungle all by himself. They flew down and picked him up. The Philippine military, not the American military. We flew him out and we flew him back to the U.S. I was back in the Philippines about 3 weeks after our hostage walked away. And the negotiator that I'd coached through the original negotiation with the terrorists said, "You're never going to believe who called." And I said to him, I got no idea who called you. And he said, the terrorist, the sociopath we'd negotiated with in a previous case. And I said, no kidding. What'd he say? And the terrorist called the negotiator that I coached and said, "Have you been promoted yet? You're really, really, really talented. Whatever happens, they should promote you." And he hung up. You know, and what he was really saying when he called and said that was like, "Man, I just called to pay my respects, and I want you to know if we ever talk, I'd deal with you again in the future." I mean, that's the power of getting somebody to say that's right. Even when they lose, they feel respected, and they let you know they deal with you in the future, which is a pretty good way to leave everybody in any negotiation you're in.
What role do you think breathing plays in helping you find that space where you can be centered and listening?
You make an interesting observation, is there's a lot of parallels over just effective behavior. You know, whether you're engaged in a sporting event or whether or not you engage in negotiations, which, you know, Jim Camp, who I learned a lot from, he wrote the book Start With No. He used to talk about negotiations and called it a human performance event. All right, so a good solid breathing pattern, of course, helps keep our system under control. Deep breaths provide more oxygen to the bloodstream, which fuels the brain. I mean, there's a lot of physiological reasons that add into, they make us think better, They keep us in a positive frame of mind. They keep our wiring open as much as possible. And certainly making sure that you breathe well is a great way to keep your brain fully supplied with oxygen and also to keep your heart rate under control.
And coming back to your work on the crisis hotline, how were you able to listen to how they were breathing?
Yeah, I would, if I could hear somebody breathing in a hyperventilated fashion, if then I pick that up, then my next job is how do I respond? And the best way for me to respond to that, interestingly enough, would be for me to say, sounds like you're upset. Sounds like your heart's probably racing right now. I can even say it sounds like you're gasping for air. My observation in that fashion, in that conversation, will help make my counterpart sufficiently self-aware to help them get their automatic pilot back on in a really good way and help get themselves under control. It's a great way to immediately create a collaborative environment where I'm helping you, but you're taking that help at your option, which actually increases the likelihood that you're going to take that help.
Chris, everybody wants to know more. How do they stay in touch with you so they can get regular tips and tricks to understand how to be a better negotiator?
The best way to get lots of free content, go to our website, blackswanltd.com, BLACKSWANLTD.com, and then find our blog, The Edge, sign up. Have it sent to you via email. Comes out every Tuesday. It's short, sweet articles, very digestible. Tips every week. Not a lot to read through. This stuff comes with practice, and not that much practice. But you can get good at this really quickly without a tremendous amount of effort. It might be a little awkward at first. If it's awkward, the great upside of that is there's a lot of capacity that you can add. Awkwardness is proportional to how much better you can get. So if it's really awkward, then you got a lot of upside. The awkwardness will get over quickly, and you get good at this really fast if you put in the time. And it's not that much time, 3 weeks maximum.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Wow, what an amazing privilege it was to listen to Chris deconstruct his craft as a listener. He expanded my understanding of what it means to be a deep listener rather than do listening. Chris reinforced the importance of what and how questions. And we've heard this before from people like Alan Stokes and Alan Parker. And both of them, as did Chris, talked about how people get defensive when you ask them why-based questions. I had to listen a couple of times to wrap my mind around verb-led questions. I did this a few times during the interview, and to be honest, I had to listen to a couple of times after the interview as well. But Chris did it so skillfully by explaining the importance of tone and inflection with questions. I love that moment where he talked about the birth of the "that's right" moment. And I hear this in the workplace all the time. I also hear it as the "what I really mean is" moment, or "what I'm really thinking" moment, or "now that I've had a bit more time to think about it, the most important thing is" moment. And that moment when you ask that question where you can simply say, "It seems like you've given this a lot of thought." I love that question from Chris. I wonder what you listened for. I know when I explore my own self-talk, it's usually not exploring the costs, the negatives, the losses, the loss aversion, but more the positives. So what Chris has done a great job for me in this interview is help to expand the number of possibilities when it comes to listening. A big thank you to the team that listens to me, to Johnny, to Nell and to June. Thanks for letting me think out aloud and create great podcasts for every one of you who listens. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lourdes Lassalle.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo Pohonu.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.